Welcome back to the deep dive. So many of you sent in sources about, well, what seems like a major ramp up of the Trump tariff war in 2025.
Indeed. A lot of articles detailing the timeline and the initial impacts.
Right. So our mission today is pretty clear. Let's dig into these sources you shared, pull out the key stuff, and really try to understand what's going on, why now, and what it actually means. Especially, for everyday life.
Absolutely. And these sources, they give us a pretty good map of the timeline and the early takes on this renewed conflict. It's complex, no doubt.
Definitely complex.
But if we stick to the info in these documents, we can piece together a clearer picture. And as the sources probably mentioned, this didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
It traces back to those 2018 tariffs.
Yeah.
Right? During the first Trump administration.
That's the starting point, yeah.
Okay, so let's maybe rewind just a bit. Based on these sources, what were they trying to achieve back in 2018? What were the main goals then?
Well, the articles you sent point to a few things. A big one was tackling the trade imbalance with China, that big gap between imports and exports.
Okay, the trade deficit.
Right, and protecting American intellectual property, concerns about copying and unauthorized use, that was key. And also trying to boost U.S. manufacturing. The idea was making imported goods, especially from China, more expensive to kind of encourage domestic production.
Got it. So imbalance, IP, manufacturing jobs, those were the 2018 drivers.
Pretty much, according to these sources.
So fast forward to 2025.
Yeah.
The sources make it really clear this isn't just more of the same. It feels like a serious escalation.
Oh, deadly an intensification.
What are the stated reasons this time around for this second wave under the returning administration?
Your sources seem to focus on two main justifications being given now. First, there's the fentanyl issue.
Right, the drug import.
Yeah, framing it as fentanyl coming into the U.S. from China and labeling that a critical national security threat.
Right.
And second, just the broader idea of national security again. Concerns about being too dependent economically, supply chain vulnerabilities, that sort of thing.
Fentanyl and national security. Those are the official whys, according to what we've read.
Okay.
Okay, let's get into the timeline then. The what happened and when, because the articles detail a really rapid-fire sequence of events.
Very rapid.
Can you walk us through the dates and the tariff hikes in 2025 based on these sources?
Sure. It kicked off pretty fast. According to the documents, February 1st, 2025, boom, a 10% baseline tariff on all goods coming in from China.
10% across the board. Wow.
Implemented via Executive Order 1415, which, an executive order means it can happen quickly, direct from the president.
Okay, so 10% right out of the gate. What happened next? How fast did things escalate according to the sources?
Well, just over a month later, March 4th, that rate doubled, up to 20%.
20%, yeah.
Then things really picked up speed. April 2nd, they added another 34%. Called it a reciprocal tariff.
Reciprocal, meaning what exactly? Like tit for tat.
Yeah, the term suggests it's either hitting back for something China did, or maybe mirroring tariffs China has on other things. The sources might have more detail on the specific justification for that label, but the result was a total tariff of 54%.
54% by early April, from 10% in February. That's steep. And it didn't end there, did it?
No, not at all. Just a week later, April 9th, another big hike. A further 50% increase.
Wait, another 50 on top?
Well, adding 50 percentage points, pushing the baseline tariff itself up to 104%.
104%.
And then just 2 days after that, April 11th, the sources say the minimum tariff hit 145%.
145% minimum. That's hard to even wrap your head around.
It's astonishingly high. And the speed, as you said, is really striking. Usually these things ratchet up more slowly, give businesses some time to react.
Right.
This pace feels like a deliberate shock tactic. Creates immediate pressure, but also massive uncertainty.
Massive uncertainty is right, 145%. So China obviously wasn't just going to watch this happen. What did the sources say about their response?
Yeah, their response was pretty forceful and quick based on these materials. They slapped retaliatory tariffs of 125% on U.S. goods.
Okay, 125% back at the U.S.
And maybe even more critically, they stopped exporting rare earth metals.
The rare earths. That's a big deal.
Huge deal. The sources probably emphasize this, right? China has spent decades building up dominance in processing these metals. They're essential for everything from smartphones to advanced military tech. So halting exports isn't just tweaking supply, it's leveraging a major strategic advantage. It hits right at the core of many tech supply chains.
Absolutely, a real choke point. Okay, so we've got this incredibly fast tariff escalation from the U.S. and a really strong counterpunch from China with tariffs and cutting off rare earth. Let's pivot to the economic fallout. How is this hitting U.S. households directly, according to the sources?
The articles point to a pretty significant hit. One estimate cited puts the average cost increase at nearly $1,300 per U.S. household just for 2025.
$1,300. Ouch. That's not small change. People would definitely feel that in prices for, well, lots of things.
Exactly. Clothes, electronics, everyday goods, a lot of that stuff comes from China or has components from there.
So that's the direct cost. What about businesses, manufacturing, supply chains? You mentioned uncertainty, but what does disruption actually look like for them based on these readings? Is it just higher costs or trouble getting parts?
It's really both. The tariffs obviously drive up the cost of importing parts and finished goods from China, so manufacturers face higher input costs.
Right.
But yes, it can also mean they literally struggle to get the components they need, which can cause production delays, maybe even shutdowns in some cases.
Oh, yeah.
And all that increased cost often gets passed along to consumers eventually. Plus, the sheer unpredictability makes it incredibly hard for businesses to plan ahead, make investments.
So it's a double whammy. Higher costs and logistical headaches, making everything less efficient.
Precisely. It creates ripples through the whole system.
And what about the bigger picture? Global trade overall. Are these sources showing wider effects beyond just the U.S. and China?
Yes, they are. The articles indicate a noticeable drop in international trade volumes generally.
Makes sense.
These high tariffs act like walls, basically, making it more expensive and difficult to move goods across borders, slows down the flow. And that slowdown contributes to greater economic uncertainty around the world. Businesses everywhere are kind of watching this and wondering what it means for them.
Okay, slower global trade, more uncertainty worldwide. Now, zooming back into the U.S. specifically, besides the household impact, what other sectors are feeling the pinch, according to these articles?
Well, we talked about consumer goods, phones, clothes, electronics getting pricier.
Right.
Manufacturing costs going up affects a huge range of industries. But the sources also highlight the pain from China's retaliatory tariffs.
Oh, okay. Like who?
American farmers are getting hit hard, facing those 125% tariffs on agricultural exports to China. That's a massive market for them.
Yeah, that's historically been huge.
In the auto industry, too. Tariffs hitting imported cars and, crucially, imported parts used in U.S. factories. It's easy to talk numbers. But yeah, these policies directly affect jobs and businesses in those sectors.
So a really wide impact across the U.S. economy?
Yeah.
Let's flip it again. What about China? They're facing these huge U.S. tariffs. What are the economic effects on their side, based on the sources?
It's kind of a mixed bag, according to these articles. There's definitely been an impact, some factory job losses, particularly in industries that exported heavily to the U.S.
Okay, so some pain there.
But the sources also point out that China's been actively diversifying. They're selling more to other places, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America.
Like new customers.
Exactly. And there's another angle. This trade fight seems to be pushing China to double down on developing its own domestic tech capabilities, to become less reliant on foreign tech, more self-sufficient.
Interesting. So it's causing problems, but also maybe accelerating their own strategic goals in some ways.
Potentially, yeah. That seems to be one interpretation presented.
What about the rest of the world? Are other countries just watching, or are they getting pulled in? What do the sources say about the wider global implications?
They're definitely not just watching. The sources talk about significant global ripples. Besides the overall slowdown in world economic growth,
Which we mentioned.
there's this increasing pressure on other countries to sort of pick a side, economically or politically, align more with either the U.S. or China.
That sounds divisive.
It can be. And the supply chain disruptions aren't just a U.S.-China problem. Businesses everywhere are rethinking where they source materials, where they manufacture. It could lead to some pretty major shifts in how things are produced globally.
Like a rewiring of the global economy, almost.
Could be. It's forcing a lot of reevaluation.
Okay, let's move into the political and strategic thinking behind all this. According to the sources, what's the U.S. administration's core strategy here? What are they trying to achieve with these really aggressive tariffs?
The main goal described in your sources seems to be putting intense economic pressure on China.
To get them to do what?
To make trade concessions, basically. Change practices the U.S. objects to. And also, fundamentally, to reduce how much the U.S. economy depends on Chinese imports. The hope seems to be that the economic pain will force China back to the negotiating table on U.S. terms.
Right. But there are critiques of that strategy mentioned in the sources, aren't there? What are the big concerns being raised?
Oh, definitely. A major counterargument highlighted is that this approach is actually backfiring, hurting the U.S. economy through those higher costs we talked about for businesses and
The
consumers.
self-inflicted wound argument.
Exactly. And also that it's damaging relationships with key allies, countries that might not agree with this kind of unilateral aggressive action.
So potentially alienating partners.
Right. There's a real worry expressed in some articles that the economic damage and diplomatic strain might end up being worse than any concessions they could possibly get from China. Is the potential gain worth that cost? That seems to be the question posed.
A high-stakes gamble, then.
Yeah.
And how is China playing this strategically, beyond just the tariffs and the rare earths we discussed?
Well, the sources indicate China's actively strengthening relationships elsewhere, building ties with Russia, Iran, other BRICS nations specifically mentioned.
Okay, consolidating an alternative bloc.
That seems to be the interpretation, yes. A strategic move to build up other partnerships, create alternative alliances, and make themselves less vulnerable to U.S. pressure.
So this is playing out on a much bigger geopolitical chessboard, too.
Absolutely. It's not just trade figures.
The sources describe this current phase as intense. What kind of future scenarios are being floated in these articles? Where could this be heading?
There are a couple of main possibilities discussed. Some analysts cited our warning this could tip the world into a global trade recession if it continues or gets worse.
A recession triggered by trade wars.
Yeah, the high tariffs just put such a drag on everything. But then others suggest this might actually push both the U.S. and China towards greater economic self-reliance in the long run.
Interesting. Like decoupling becomes a reality.
More towards developing their own domestic industries, reducing the mutual dependency that's defined the relationship for decades. Two quite different potential outcomes.
Very different. Recession versus self-reliance. What about longer-term dangers? Is there talk of this escalating even further?
There's definitely concern raised in your sources about this turning into a broader economic Cold War.
A Cold War, wow.
Yeah, not just tariffs, but impacting global alliances, who gets access to what technology, maybe driving up inflation worldwide for a long time. Really profound, lasting consequences.
That paints a pretty serious picture. So given everything in these sources, the escalation, the impacts, the strategies, what's the sense of the likely long-term outlook? Is there an end game envisioned?
Well, nobody knows for sure, obviously, but some experts quoted still think negotiations between the U.S. and China are possible eventually.
Eventually.
Yeah, but the tone in your sources seems to suggest that's unlikely to happen until both sides feel significantly more economic pain, until the cost of continuing the fight seems higher than the cost of talking.
So potentially more economic disruption before any resolution.
That seems to be the implication, yes.
Okay, so let's try to wrap up the key takeaways from this deep dive into your sources on the 2025 Trump tariff war. We saw this incredibly rapid, steep escalation of U.S. tariffs starting in February.
Right, hitting 145% minimum by April.
Met by strong Chinese retaliation,
Yeah.
125% tariffs, and, critically, that halt on rare earth exports.
Big economic consequences followed for both sides. U.S. households facing higher costs, key industries like farming and auto feeling the pain, supply chains disrupted globally.
And China seeing some export job losses, but also diversifying markets and maybe boosting domestic tech development.
And the bigger picture, slowing global trade, pressure on other countries, and this strategic maneuvering with the U.S. aiming to pressure China.
But facing risks to its own economy and alliances.
And China strengthening ties elsewhere, leading to concerns about a potential economic Cold War.
Yeah, that's a good summary of what these articles laid out. What really stands out is just the sheer speed and scale of these 2025 moves compared to 2018.
Absolutely. It really signals a different level of tension, doesn't it? And maybe a willingness to use much more disruptive trade tools.
It certainly feels like we're in a new phase, maybe uncharted territory in some ways. So a final thought for you, our listeners, you digest all this from the sources you provided. Could this really intense tariff war fundamentally reshape how global trade works, maybe redraw economic alliances in ways we can't quite see yet, forcing all of us, individuals and nations, to adapt to a potentially very different economic world? Something to think about based on what we've unpacked today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.